Hello, everybody. This is Patrick from 8-Bit Doodads here with my first DOScember video exploring vintage IBM PC or compatibles capable of running IBM or PC DOS.
Say, kids, what time is it?
It's 8-Bit Doodads time!
For some time now, I've been collecting parts and systems and components for projects I've wanted to work on but haven't gotten to yet. And if you've seen some of my previous series, one I had on Apple Talk and one I had on Corvus OmniNet, those two particular networking technologies were interesting to me because I had come in contact with them in the past. And in fact, I have here, this is a Corvus OmniNet board, and you can see the 3-pin connector, which is just like the Apple version that connects in the dip switches for setting the bus address, etc. And it says Corvus Systems Transporter on it. But it uses the 8-bit slot of an IBM PC. So I've always wanted to have a machine that would take this card so I could look at adding MS-DOS to my Corvus OmniNet. That was one of my thoughts. When I got into the Apple Talk networking, and there's a series on that, and I'll put a link to that in the description. I also have an 8-bit slot Apple Talk card. The problem was on modern machines there are no these ISA slots. They're not on more modern machines. If you found a Pentium mid-range system, you might find one of these slots. But everything before that, the 486, the 386, the 286, and of course the 8088, which was the original IBM PC, had these kinds of slots. So I was always interested in that. And over time, with my ewaste partner Greg, I've collected materials to work on this particular project. And in fact, one of the first pieces of material he gave me, I'm going to take this out of the way for right now, was this, which is a 386 DX motherboard that has both the 8-bit and 16-bit ISA slots. We're talking about way before PCIe, PCI, etc. This was the original bus that came into an IBM PC, an IBM AT, and all the compatibles around that time. And in fact, if you look, you can see this card would slide right into that slot. So I've always wanted to get a working machine that would accept these kinds of cards, so I could work with them and see how they perform. I also have some SCSI cards that use this bus and some other peripherals. So Greg gave me this 486 motherboard. He also gave me a bunch of RAM, and in this particular case, there was 30-pin DIMMs that worked with this, and I got 4 of them to fill these banks. If I can fill the other banks with 4 more, I can get more memory on it. So that gave me a motherboard to work with this machine. What I didn't realize when I got started on this project, we're all using newer PCs with the newer power supplies, and what we're used to is a power supply that looks like this, whereas the power supply on this machine is this old standard, which is the same thing that an IBM PC used. So I went out and bought an adapter, and I'm going to go down the line of trying to get this to work. While doing this, and like I said, I've been collecting parts for a long time, more things came in through ewaste, and in fact, we have this machine right here, which is an original IBM PC XT with a CGA or color graphics adapter monitor. Um, and that could be useful for using the 8-bit slots. But I also picked up a couple other machines that came in ewaste. These are both Pentiums, and there's another very tall machine down here, which I believe is a Pentium as well. And so I thought, for DOScember, why not go through this? Let's see what works and see if we can get a working DOS system and then maybe a working Windows 3.1 system, which runs on top of DOS. And then eventually, I think Windows 95 and Windows ME and Windows 98 maybe still ran on top of DOS. So they're considered DOS systems. So I thought that was a perfect entry for DOScember. Since I got this 386 motherboard as the start of all this project, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about where I've gone with trying to move this particular system along. As I said, I got memory modules and I found ones that work with it. I also found, in fact, from a local Vero Beach place, had both a ISA game and sound card and an ISA VGA card. So I found video input or video output and a sound controller for this. So those are two components. I also bought online, I mentioned this, which was to allow me to connect up to the power supply here. And it connects into a standard, what we now think of as ATX power supply. But one of the things I read online, and so I'm not sure of, so therefore I'm backing away from, is if I look on this board, it shows the plus 5 volt, 12 volt, minus 12 volt, grounds, etc. But one of these leads is negative 5 volts. And what I've come to understand is that the newer power supplies don't supply negative 5 volts. So that worried me. So what I've come to realize is that maybe a PC or AT power supply would be better for this motherboard. And I have an answer to that that we're gonna talk about over there. I also found the pinouts and the switch settings for this motherboard. So as we go down that path, we have that in store for us. Also here, I'm trying to go through the parts so you can see how they might relate to all these projects. I have a whole group of hard drives that have come in through ewaste, and several of them are very interesting. This is a SCSI drive. You can see it has that LVM, I think it is, or LVE SCSI connector. So I have a SCSI drive there, but I have some other interesting ones. That's a 5.5 inch, 5.25 inch, 5.25 inch hard drive with a standard IDE connector. These are all things that we can test to put into the system. SCSI drives. So I have a whole palette of hard drives to look from that might work in that system. And in fact, here's one of the more unique ones. Again, an IDE hard drive. And the reason you can tell it's IDE, it's missing that pin in the middle, which was typical. So we have a standard set of a bunch of hard drives that might work in these old machines. This particular one won't work in any machine I have, but I figured I'd bring it up to you. Looks like a standard 3.5 inch hard drive. And what you note back here is it looks like a standard ISA slot or what would have been a floppy drive connector on the back. This is what a PS2, IBM PS2 in the Model 30 and maybe even in the 50 and the 70s using IDE, they put their own connector on the back. So instead of being the connector I showed you here, They transformed it into this connector, so the hard drive slit in through the front of the machine, or slid in through the front of the machine, and connected to a riser card on the back of the machine. They just changed the connector style. It's really just an IDE drive. But I have these to use. I also have, and this is something I sourced because of these projects, you'll see what looks like two really old keyboards. And in fact, if you recognize them, they both have DIN 5 connectors. There's a huge difference though. This standard DIN connector works on an AT or a Pentium system. AT meant 286, 386, 486. Pentium system, Pentium 1, Pentium 2. They might still have had this, and these keyboards might have come with the adapters for the PS2, and they work with those newer machines. If you look over here to this machine, this is an original IBM PC XT. The PC and the XT use the DIN 5 connector, but the signaling was different than an AT or a Pentium system. And so what you had to find, and I finally found through scrap this, see there's a little switch here, and the switch says X and A. That's XT and AT. This is a original PC style keyboard, even though it looks the same as this one, but it could electrically respond to being plugged into an original IBM 5150 PC or a 5160 XT. So this was a find to allow me to finally get this thing to work, if it will. So that's what this keyboard's for. This keyboard's for these older machines. So our next step is, let's see which of these works, and then we can get back to my motherboard and hard drives and other projects. So let's first take a look at our really vintage machine. This is an IBM Personal Computer XT, or what they call a 5160. And I've taken the screws off the back, so I'm going to pull the cover off so we can take a look at it. And this is actually the way I originally found it. We have some cards in here, floppy drive, and there is a hard drive down here, and we're going to talk about that in a second. This has those 8-bit ISA slots that we're talking about that would accept the cards that I'm looking to use. This first long card here is a computer graphics adapter, or CGA card, that works with our, I moved down on the floor, CGA monitor. There's also a RAM expansion board here. This particular motherboard has 4 rows of 64K or 256K of memory on the motherboard. So, and an IBM PC could take 640K. So I found there was a graphics card in here, a memory adapter in here. And what was interesting is I did get this machine to boot up originally, and in fact it was in a previous video of showing some things that came through eWaste, and it only went through 320K. I then pulled out this board and took a look at it and the settings on it and everything else, and I found that this board had 2 banks of 64K of memory and 1 bank of 256, which in theory would give us a total of 640K, but it was only registering 320. I tried some different switch settings on the board, and I finally got it to recognize 512K of memory on the machine, but I couldn't get it to 640. I don't know if there's something wrong with the memory in here, the board, or what have you, but that is definitely something to look at for a future project. Next in here, we have another card, and I believe this is a standard parallel printer port card for this. In fact, here, we'll turn this machine up, and you can see that looks like a parallel printer port. On IBM's, this DB25 female was typically a parallel printer, and a DB25 male, where you'd see the pin sticking out, that was a serial port. You'll see another very long port here, which is for this card, which is the floppy controller, which you can see the floppy drive connected to it here. The last card here, which I found very interesting, didn't actually have the bracket on it to attach it in the back, is a Western Digital hard drive controller, and you can see it has this one wide ribbon and then two short. On Western Digital hard drives of this nature, which were MFM or RLL hard drives, they used one shared wide connector, and you can see the little twists in the cables and whatever. This would go to both, if you had two hard drives, this would go to both hard drives, but then each hard drive would have one connector here. One of the things that I don't get is you'll see one of the pins is missing, which is typical and keyed. But you see here on this card, it has a different pin bent down, and the keyed slot and where pin 1 was, it's not what I would have expected. With the bent pin, this does work, and it's because there's a block in one of the slots. It was blocked here. That missing pin, the block should have been somewhere else. So I'm not sure if there's a problem with how they wired this drive, this particular controller, how other MFM drives would have been. I do want to explore that more. But that's what we have with this machine. I'm actually going to take that aside. So I did try plugging this in with the pins bent the way it was and booting it, and I was getting a 1701 error, which said the controller or the hard drive or the cabling was bad. I don't know if it's because these cables are weird, the controller's weird, or the drive is actually bad. Putting that aside, I did get out that keyboard I told you about before with the switch and had it plugged in. The first time I ever booted up this machine, I was getting a keyboard error until I found an appropriate keyboard for the machine. That's gone away. But now when I boot the machine, and I can show you that if you like, it boots to IBM Basic, which is based in ROM. I've tried several floppies in this. It will not boot them anymore. The very first time, I think a year ago when I had this running, it did boot some floppies. I have a feeling that some floppy I put in and it has dirtied the heads. So I'm going to try using a cleaning kit that I bought on eBay to clean this. But that's what the status of the machine is. It will boot to the monitor, to IBM Basic with this keyboard. It'll recognize 512K of memory. The graphic card is working, and the floppy tries to boot but doesn't. This hard drive combo that was in this machine has never booted. So that's sort of the inventory on this machine as it sits today. So this is the next machine in our pile to give a look at. I've taken the screws off already, so we're going to open it up. And here we can tell we have a standard Pentium system. It's got a VGA video card, and these are PCIe slots. Now this does have down in here 16-bit ISO slots. So this would work for the projects I've talked about putting in the Corvus card or an AppleTalk card in it. It has multiple IDE drives. fact, I have multiple ID connectors, and it has what I see is two ID hard drives here, and it looks like it might have an ID um, CD-ROM, and in fact, looking at it, it has three ID hard drives and the ID-ROM. Standard 20-pin ATX power supply. Oh, that's ID. I was just looking to see what the cables are in it. And here we go. It has a floppy controller that handles both the 34 pin and the standard, basically the 3.5-inch floppy connector and a 5.25-inch floppy connector. So this machine would allow us to restore it to that base state of hard drives, 5.25 and 3.5-inch floppy drives, and have ISA slots. So this would be a good machine for my AppleTalk and Corvus projects, and also anything vintage. This would run DOS, it would run Windows, certainly would run Windows 95. I thought before we moved on exploring the next machine that I've collected for this project, we'd see if this one runs. And also, you can see here, I set up the IBM PC with the CJ monitor, and it's booted. As I said, it can't read the floppy right now, and the hard drive is throwing an error. So that's one of the restoration projects we're going to have to do is getting the hard drive working. The floppy did work, as I said before, so that might just be a cleaning, and I have a cleaning kit. So that's where we stand on that. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and plug it in. And I'll tell you, I cheated a few minutes ago and had already plugged it in just to see what was happening. And I was getting nothing on the screen, but I was getting a whole bunch of beeping from here. And what I had to do is, if you know, on these old machines, there's one of those clear CMOS and recovery modes and what have you. And by putting that in, I was able to it finally would boot and take me to the BIOS screen. And what I found out is, you'll see this has a VGA card in it, and you can see the monitors booting up. There's one of the beeps that you just heard. Because I wasn't seeing the screen, I didn't know it was stopping on because the floppy drive isn't plugged in, but one is configured in the BIOS. The other thing that was going wrong, and why it just was beeping at me and I didn't see anything, is inside of the BIOS setup, it was set for this to have an AGP card, which is that dedicated faster slot they came out with after PCI. Whereas this actually has a PCI video card in it. I changed that setting, and it's booting to the testing screen, and I can actually tell it to resume, and it should come up, and it's going to. I plugged in the hard drive, wasn't even plugged in, and power, and so we're going to see what this will boot from, if anything. And it's taken a while, so it may be that we have a bad drive. No, okay. So it's booting up to Windows XP, um, the boot screen, which would allow me to go into the recovery console um, or boot from Windows XP. So this machine is working. It has 192 megs, I almost said K, megs of memory. I think it can be pushed further. And from what I remember in the BIOS screen, I think it has about a 500 megahertz um, Pentium 2, and it's one of those cartridge slot types. Also, when I was investigating the machine, looking inside and changing that settings, I noticed it has three hard drives. Only one of them is plugged in. I'm not sure what's on the others, and it does have a CD-ROM drive. Might be a DVD-ROM. Nope. I think that's a CD. Um, so we can have a lot of different drive options on here. So this might be a really good machine to put DOS, Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows 2000, some of those, and it will run XP. But if we're trying to do that older experience, I like to see this run some of the earlier Windows versions to have one of those kinds of machines in our stable. All right, the third machine we have for you is this one. It's a Micron, and just opening up and looking at it, I found a few surprises. The first one I found inside the floppy drive was a IBM DOS boot disk, which might be just what we need to install DOS on one of these machines. Um, there's a Sound Blaster card in here. There is a really old Ethernet card in here, and the reason I know it's old is it has the BNC connector on the front of it, and it has the I believe this is an AGP style video card, VJ video card in its dedicated slot. 2 of 3 RAM sticks are present, and again we have one of those cartridge loading type Pentium processors. One nice thing about this config is it has both a 5 1/4 inch and a 3 1/2 inch floppy drive built in. It also has a zip drive, which that could be really great in the retro world, because if you have, this is an IDE zip drive, and if you have a SCSI base zip drive, which I have a couple of, which you can hang off of your Apple IIs and other vintage machines, anything that will take a SCSI, a Macintosh, you can use the zip drive in here with the emulator software and other utilities to make disks that are then bootable on, say, an Apple II. And it allows you to move files back and forth using the zip disk format. And since these disks are capable of holding 100 megabytes, that's larger than the file systems on, say, an Apple II. In fact, you could fit 3 full 32 meg drive partitions on one zip drive. And again, be able to put it in the PC, use those drive images with an emulator, make changes, then take the zip disk and put it back on the Apple II and boot it up. So I'm looking forward to that. This thing also has an ID hard drive back here and a clear indication I worked on this machine at some point. It has one of those IDE to compact flash adapters, and there's a 16 gig compact flash card in here. The reason I'm thinking I had something to do with this is it's held on to the inside with the zip tie, which is one of my usual practices. So I'm thinking that was me. We'll find out. I'm going to go ahead and plug in the video. And this is going to be my first boot, at least in a long, long time. Fan makes lots of noise. Oh, that's getting a little bit quieter. There we go. There's 383 megs of memory, and I think it's 384. And here was something I was expecting on that other machine. It's telling me to check date and time. One of the things I pulled out for today's DOS projects is a whole new pack of batteries. I was thinking I needed to replace one in that, and in fact, that might be the reason that the video was set wrong, is that the battery actually died, so the BIOS wasn't, it went into default, which was not the right kind of graphics card. I'm going to take a flyer and put this floppy drive back in. And reboot again. It's reading from the floppy. And it has booted the floppy. Somebody said this might be a great DOS machine, especially with the CF cards where we can make different bootable operating systems. And there are options for getting these mounted outside, or I could do something to mount the CF card so it's sticking out the front. And in fact, Greg just bought a 3D printer, which you might have seen. He did a video on, so he could make a custom plate for me to put on the front of this machine. One thing I hadn't mentioned before, this does have one of those 16-bit ISA slots. So this would take the Corvus card or the AppleTalk card. In fact, it has two of those, and the sound card in here is using one of them. I could free up that second slot because I have PCI versions of sound cards, so I could swap that out. Also, this graphics card in here is a total dud. It only has 4 megs of onboard memory. I might have a better AGP card I could put in here. And the Ethernet card, I'm sure, is only a 10 meg card. It is a 3-COM card, which is good because a lot of the older operating systems, you can get drivers for 3-COM cards where you might not for off-market cards, especially the newer versions. So I'm going to put this away and bring up our next machine. Now, the last machine we have may be the most interesting, and for several different reasons. First of all, if you look at it, you can tell this was one of those gigantic tower machines. In fact, it has this base that almost makes it annoying, but because it's so tall, you needed it so the thing wouldn't easily kick over. Just looking at the front of it, we have a 3.5-inch floppy drive. We have a 5.25-inch floppy drive. We have two, and I believe they're both CD-ROM drives. This says 6-plex. This may be a multi-lumper. I'm going to have to check. If it is, it may require it looks like it needs a cartridge. So I may not want to keep that around. This thing also has a zip drive built into it. So basically it has all the different kinds of media we might like. When you come to the inside, again, given the nature of how big the case is, there's places for 2 additional external 3.5-inch devices if you wanted them, or you could put hard drives in there, and there is a hard drive in there. They also have an extra bay way at the top here for mounting 2 more internal hard drives. One of the things that makes this so interesting is, I don't know if you could see the big flat ribbon cable, which should be plugged into here. This thing has a SCSI card in it, and I believe one of the DVD drives is SCSI. There's also, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm remembering, there may be a SCSI hard drive in here, buried behind this plate, possibly. There's also IDE drives, and of course, with our floppies, there's a floppy connector. Now, I believe this machine is a Pentium as well, because that's what it says up front. But it's a not those cartridge slots, but a plug into the motherboard, and I forget what type that is. It does say down there. In addition to the SCSI card that's in here, it has that looks like a modem, VGA card, has a sound card, and an Ethernet networking card. This, I believe, is older than those other 2 Pentiums, and the reason I say that is because it uses a DIN 5 keyboard connector, so which tells me it's older. And the other thing is, and this is the thing that I'm really excited about. If you look down here in the power connector, they have extra serial or parallel port connectors here. You'll see that there's a power connector there that's a standard 20-pin ATX, which is not being used because it's using the old PCAT P8, P9 power connector with this power supply. And the reason that excited me is, I could pull this whole guts out and put a 486 in here, put my 486 motherboard in there, because that's the power it wants. And then it dawned on me, the thing to do is, we're going to remove this power supply and put in a standard ATX power supply, which I have a bunch of, and I could build a whole new system using this power supply, the 486 motherboard, that VGA card I got for it from the Florida Retro Group. Um, so, like I said, this thing dovetails into a whole bunch of projects. The motherboard on here has an AGP slot for video. Again, I could upgrade from whatever the video that's in here, as well as PCI slots. But it also has 3 of those ISA 16-bit slots. So again, I could put my Corvus board or some of the other, or the Apple Talk board in here, or any other 8-bit cards. I have SCSI cards that are both PCIe, and I believe I have some that are those 16-bit SCSIs. So that would allow me to put zip drives into other machines that might not have them using those 16-bit slots. One thing I'm noticing here, I don't know if you can see, there's the typical motherboard, all the jumpers and wires for the reset and the on-off switch, etc., are along here, and the CPU slot is right here. And I don't know if you remember, and if I can get it, that Corvus OmniNet board is like this long. And all 3 slots are running into stuff that it might hit. It may work in this particular slot, but that could be trouble for me down the road. I'm not going to fire this one up, or should we? Should we take a chance? I have the keyboard. We can plug it in. I have power. And VGA. Okay. One of the things I just noticed on the back of the power supply is it has both the power in and power out to power your monitor, which was typical in some of these. That IBM CGA monitor I was using, I was plugging into the wall directly, and you can turn it on and off. If I get one of those, what looks like an extension cable for standard power, I could actually power it from the power supply. And I think the advantage of that is it will turn on and off the monitor for you without having to remember to turn it on. Oop. I get lights. I got a screen. Oh, okay. This is not what I thought it was at all. That's an AMD K6 processor. It looks like it has 98 megs of memory. Let's see if it has a hard drive. The SCSI is an Adaptec AAH 2940. And it found no devices on there. Yep, 98 megs. Windows ME. So we have an operating system. I have not plugged in a mouse. And in fact, something just dawned on me. Of all the cards back here that I mentioned, the video card, SCSI, networking and all, the one card that wasn't present was a USB card. Now that I think about it, this doesn't have any PS2. There are no PS2 connectors. There are no USB connectors. So the only way you could have a mouse on this thing is through one of the serial ports, and you'd have to have a serial mouse, which I don't think I have. Stay tuned. The next video is going to be getting one or more of these running DOS, and maybe bringing up DOSBox style games on it. In fact, I might go look see what other DOS games that I have, or DOS software. I think I have the Turbo Pascal, Lotus 123, WordStar, that kind of thing. And then we can maybe get Windows 3.11 or Windows 2000 or something like that running up on this machine. So stay tuned. Look forward to seeing that. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. You'll get notified when we have new videos. And if you haven't already, you might want to look at our Advent Calendar series, which is being published all this month.